Before I get started here, I just wanted to say that our success early on was defined by some of the success that we had with Dadson blade baits. And the blade with no name came from that collaboration with Dadson, and we owe them a lot of gratitude for helping us become what we became. And it's in an ironic twist that things fell apart as fast as they started, but I do want to let you guys know that we appreciate everything that Johnny did for us early on. I don't remember the year I bought my first Dadson, probably somewhere in 13 or 14 at Bobby's Sports Shop. That was before my wife was probably working there full time. It was a 9mm. I actually had some pretty good success on it, and I got one really cool fish on it. And Dadson always had that mystique of just, they weren't available everywhere, and those that had them seemed to have a lot of success with them. And it was something that I tried to replicate over the years with the Dadsons, and they were hard to find. And I don't know exactly how I got on Johnny's radar. I think it was a fish that we caught on Indian Lake Chain, and I posted a picture of it with the bump board in front of me, and it had I think it said hashtag 54bust or just 54bust, and Johnny sent me a message. He's like, I really like the cool 54bust logo on the bump board. And I think that was the first contact I had ever had from Johnny. In 2019, I conversed with Johnny via message, and to this day, I've never met him face to face. I think we might have had one phone conversation, if I remember correctly. I'm not 100% sure on that. But in 2019, I think he took a liking to what we were doing up in northwestern Ontario. He asked me for my address. I didn't think very much of it. I didn't expect anything. And a few weeks later, I received a 10mm Dadson with the famous Skullette blades, which is the skull print all over. And anybody that remembers 2019, that Dadson blade set were all the rage. Everybody wanted them. And that ties into Johnny's sense of marketing. He understands marketing. He understands supply and demand. I give him a lot of credit for that. And we did have a lot of talks about that kind of stuff, even as it kind of pertained to 54bust. So that was the first one I ever received from Johnny, and we had a lot of success with it that season, caught quite a few fish on it. And I think it was probably into 2020 or that winter that Johnny invited me into the Dadson, quote unquote, IC, the Insiders Club on Facebook. And like every bait builder and every company has their own private blacklist sales, whatever you want to call it, their own private club, invite only on Facebook. This was an early version of it. And I got in there, and it's a small group. Johnny sells baits that he builds in there. And to the best of my knowledge, that's the only place you're going to get a Johnny Dadson built Dadson blade bait. The ones that you buy, whether it was through the website or the ones that I believe Mike Holbert are selling now, those are not built by Johnny Dadson. Those are outsourced. Pete Bostelman built a lot for the website. And I don't know the specifics on the ones that are being sold by Mike Holbert right now, but I believe they're being built by a company in Minnesota. Again, I don't know 100%, but that's what I understand. So if you want a Johnny Dadson built and tested and tuned bucktail, you have to be in the IC. The IC is an interesting place. It's beyond the scope of this video to talk about what it is that they do in there, but suffice to say, they do a lot of stuff where you can buy Dadson blade baits, you can win them, you can be put into draws. He does a lot of interesting things. I'll just leave it at that. I was a big part of it. My kids were a big part of it. My wife helped out a lot. We did a lot within the IC group, and we became, I would say, prominent members of it. And I think it would have been the summer of 21, Johnny has this thing where he puts 3 to 6, 7 people as a prospect. Think of it as a motorcycle club. If you want to be a member, you got to prospect for a year. It's just one of his idiosyncrasies, and it's one of the things that makes Johnny Dadson, I guess. And in February of 21, the very first, what was going to become a blade with no name was offered. And I ended up picking up prototype number 4, I believe it was, for $40 from Sam. And I think in a lot of cases it was a bait that was just going to be kind of forgotten in the lexicon of Dadson blade baits. It wasn't anything special. People weren't actually lining up to buy this one. It was what they called a top-loading bait. So it was going to be a single hook up top with a built-in dangle blade and no hook at the bottom. They described it as for the super aggressive fish that were hitting in the 8 and head hunting. I bought it. I wasn't really sure. And Dave and I got out with it, and right away we seen that they were nipping at that tail, at that dangle blade. So we came back to the shop, and I figured out a way to get a hook on the back. And early on, because this was a Sam build, she was not using a split ring for the dangle. She was, connecting it as she was building it. So it was very hard to add anything to it. So I did, and it transformed that blade. We went on a tear in 21, and everybody in the IC took notice. Anybody that had that bait wanted to know how I put the hook on. I did a video, posted it within the Dadson group. People were taking notice. Any of the other style of dangle blade ones that Sam was building, people were doing the same thing. And interestingly enough, it was originally called the Gronkle. That's what Sam called it. And because Johnny has these strange rules where he wants to keep things private, it's Fight Club. What happens in Fight Club stays in Fight Club kind of thing. It just doesn't exist. So we just kept saying, we caught this on a Dadson with a dangle blade. And we didn't coin that term, but it stuck. And other builders started adding a quote-unquote dangle blade. And we didn't, like I said, we didn't invent that. It's just, there was an easy way to say it. And as we got into the tail end of the summer season of 21, people were taking notice of the fish we were catching with this particular bait. And I wanted to do something fun video-wise. I wanted to do like a movie trailer about this bait. And the idea goes back a few years earlier. I used a Lake X toad and had a lot of success one year. And my buddy Steve was like, man, you guys should have documented the whole year of that bait. It would have been such a cool story. So because we had kind of did that with this Gronkle, I wanted to do something fun to kind of promote it and bring it to the public. Last summer, something happened in the musky world. Rumors began to circulate of a bucktail so secretive, only those on the inside knew. My name's Glenn McDonald. I received proto number 4. The results were nothing short of astonishing. So the idea was to produce a movie trailer style clip that would draw some hype to the bait. And I kind of didn't know if I should just name it the Gronkle. So I went to Sam and Johnny and I was like, do you guys want me to just make that name public? Just call it the Gronkle, or come up with something a little bit more unique, something to go along with that Dadson mystique? And they said, just run with whatever you want to do. So I got thinking and I was like, I want it to be something interesting, something cool, something that grabs the imagination. And as I was looking at doing this movie trailer, I kept going back to like the spy movies, the James Bond trailers and that style of music. And I was like, what's a name that would be fitting of this? And I just stumbled upon it, A Blade with No Name, and it just stuck. And I called it that. And when I dropped that trailer, the world, the musky world, only knew that bait as A Blade with No Name. And that started this insane demand for that bait. I was getting 4 to 5 messages a week. Where do I get a Dadson Blade with No Name? Or you would see it online as a 54 bust, blade with no name, or no name blade. People were asking about it. And it was all because of that movie trailer and just coming up with that interesting name. So full props to Dadson, and specifically Sam Dadson. She built that, called it the Gronkle, but we transformed that into something that was bigger than just that bait. It became as synonymous with 54 bust as it did with Dadson. And Johnny would post in the ICs like, don't ask me for a blade with no name. Don't ask me for this. That's the wife's bait. And he would go on posts that might show up online and be like, don't ask for that bait. It doesn't exist, or I don't build that bait. So it was one of those things where it was gaining popularity, but it was also starting to define who it was we were. I remember in the IC, Pete Bostelman making mention that the Blade with No Name was the second most requested Dadson blade bait ever, only behind the bone saw. So we always felt like that was a really cool stat because we had a big hand in that. What it was that we were doing in social media was really help drive that Dadson name back to the forefront in musky fishing. And Dadson's always had that mystique and that following, but I think we, at 54 Bus, we brought it back into the mainstream, and people that maybe had never heard of Dadson or didn't know of it from the early, heyday, we're starting to find Dadson again. And throughout 22 and 23, probably at least 4 times a week, I got messages, where can I get a blade with no name? Early on, Sam was a huge supporter of what we were doing and the hype it was getting. She was building me sets of them, 6 at a time. We did some really cool giveaways, some really cool draws for them. We tried to get some out to the public, and I was playing into that hype as well. Like, I gotta admit, it was something that was really cool, really fun for us to help develop that bait and turn it into something, almost culturally within that musky community. Something happened within the Dadson community where Johnny was trying to build me something that I think would take the place of a blade with no name. In 23, Johnny built me this triple bladed bucktail, and he called it the Old McDonald. I got a really nice fish on eagle with it, and Johnny wanted me to use it more He's like, call it the trike with no name. He also built me a 5-bladed bucktail and called it 5 blades with no name. I still have that. I'm sure that's the only one that exists. I caught fish on that. It just proves that Johnny was always pushing. And I think sometimes the success of some of his classic baits, like the 9mm, the long ball, I think that gets old for him, and he wants to push the boundaries forward. I understand that, but our fans, our viewers, they wanted a blade with no name. It had the hype, it had the name, it had a lot of things going for it. So it was really tough to try and deal with that and not be able to get as many to people that I would like to. Fast forward to the fall of 23, and I got an offer from Sam to essentially build a blade with no name in-house, sell it at my wife's shop, and give Johnny and Sam a commission or a royalty on each sale. They wanted us to reap some of the rewards of the success of it, and that was very intriguing to me. I had never tied flash before, so I did reach out to a third party to try and tie my flash. So I was lining that up behind the scenes. I would do all the building here, and just so you guys know, this isn't outside of the norm for Dadson. There's couple guys in there right now. KV, he builds baits, he sells them within the IC as a Dadson with the Dadson stickers, but it's built by him. Like I'd said, Pete Bostelman built probably the majority of the baits that were sold on the Dadson Canada site, the Dadson A site. So it's not uncommon. And the offer was put out there. I thought about it, and because I didn't jump at it right away, Johnny kind of changed it. He's like, well, maybe we shouldn't do a blade with no name. Maybe I should just do some of our tried and true stuff. Maybe the 10mm would be one that you guys could do and sell that. And it's like the goalposts were always changing on what he wanted us to do, build and or sell. The funny thing with Dadson is that you never knew where they were going to take lure design or where they were going to focus their energy. And they always came to us and asked, hey, these are what you guys should use, or the things they were selling in the IC, they were trying to lean us towards stuff. So when we finally got the opportunity to quote unquote work with them, it was so strange to have that come from Johnny. Instead of selling a blade with no name, I want you to use these lures instead. And it was probably the start of our relationship fracturing down the center. So while we were kind of discussing behind the scenes about the possibility of us building some baits and selling them in bobbies, I had come up with an idea that I wanted to hold a really cool contest going into 24. I knew that, like any bait in the industry, it only has a shelf life of a few years with that hype, and then that hype starts to fall off. And I knew that was going to happen with a blade with no name. It was inevitable. And a couple things happened in 23 leading into the fall. My wife, Kyla, was quote unquote prospect. I had already made pro staff, and they promoted me as pro staff on social media. That was great. We went along with that, but my wife doesn't get much time to fish, and Johnny was somewhat upset. He's like, well, what do we got to do to get Kyla more involved with the IC and more more involved with wanting to be a quote unquote prospect. And I'm just like, she just doesn't have time, Johnny. And Kyla just wasn't into the games and the rhetoric inside of the IC. And I was starting to not lose interest, but I just didn't have the time for it. We were just getting too busy with 54 Bus. I just didn't have time to do the things that they were doing in there. And my thought was I wanted to hold this contest going into the new year where I get Sam to build 2 baits that were as close to my original, which unfortunately my original's laying in the bottom of Eagle Lake, not far from my brother-in-law's cabin, in about 11 or 12 feet of water. And Sam agreed, thought it was a good idea. And my idea was going to get 2 identical baits. I was going to fish one all year, and I was going to let people pick how many fish I was going to catch on it, and then I would sell it at the end of the year as a multiple of 10. So say I catch 10 fish, it's $100, or we would come up with something, and the winner could pick either the brand new one or the kind of game worn version, the one that I caught the fish on, and I would keep the other one. And then that would be kind of the bookend on a blade with no name. And then I would move on to something different. That was kind of always Johnny's wish, to just move on to something different. And I thought that would be a good way to put a blade with no name kind of to bed and just move on. And that was kind of the beginning of the end with where my relationship was going with Dadson. As we got into 2024, into January, February, March, I could feel there was a disconnect in the industry, to be honest, and we've talked about it in past videos. We went to Odyssey, we went to Minnesota. Things were changing, but there was this weird disconnect with Johnny and Sam in the IC. I wasn't as involved anymore. There's a couple new guys that come in that were more gun-ho to play the games. One thing Johnny did say to me is like, well, let's have a contest. We'll have one of KV's baits go up against your blade with no name, and at the end of the year, we'll see who catches more or bigger. And I'm just like, I'm not playing games. I'm not into that. That just didn't interest me. And as a brand, we just had too much to lose playing a game like that. So things were slipping away, and I think the end was inevitable, whether it was from them or from me. And as we were getting closer to the season, and I was like, Sam, I really want to do this contest. And she's like, yeah. And like, baits are built and they're boxed up and I'll get them out. And then nothing. And the season started. I was like, Sam, what's happening? Nothing. And I messaged Johnny, and Johnny's like, oh, the wife's not in the shop much anymore. I don't know what to tell you. And it was clear that things were not going good. And it was early July, and I was like, what's going on, Sam? Like, can you either send those baits out or just send my money back? And I was going to go to somebody else that could build me a couple baits that we've had success with in the past. And I'm not going to mention the names, but a couple of the other companies were like, yeah, no problem, whatever you need. And finally, Johnny's like, okay, the baits are on their way. And for the record, this is what she sent. They're not exactly the same, but these are 2 identical blade with no name, with a brass and a chartreuse blade, silver flash, and brass dangle blade. These were the ones I was going to fish and give away. I will never disconnect this. This is going to stay exactly like this. This was the last baits I ever received from Dadson Blade Baits, and I would assume it's the last baits I'll ever purchase or get from Johnny. And it's ironic that she felt so disrespected by us that it just, nothing we did mattered at that point. And I didn't know exactly why it was she was trying to make 54 bus seem like it just didn't matter in the modern Dadson world, because I think for a lot of people, we brought Dadson back to the public in a lot of ways through our videos and our publicity. And I woke up one day and I asked Johnny, like, what's up with Sam? Why is she trying to make it seem like 54 bus doesn't exist, or we never did anything for Dadson? And then basically a day later, I assume it was Sam, but it was personal. She kicked me out of the IC, and that was the last time I've ever had any dealings with Johnny or Sam. And in full disclosure, I did reach out to Johnny to ask if he wanted to comment, and if he did comment, I was going to include his full comment, whether it was good, bad, or otherwise, in this video, because I felt I needed to tell the public what had happened to our relationship and what happened to A Blade with No Name. Looking back on it now, a full year removed from any kind of real association with Dadson, I look at it as it was a chapter, it was a season in our lives. And again, we owe a lot to them. They put a lot of trust in us, and I think in some fashion our success is what ruined that relationship. This is my opinion. I think Johnny was upset that we had as much success as we did have with A Blade with No Name, and I was vocal within the IC and throughout social media that I always thought The Blade with No Name was the greatest bucktail that Dadson had ever made. And in that ironic twist, it wasn't a Johnny Dadson bucktail, it was a Sam Dadson design, a Sam Dadson build. And I think that, again, this is my opinion, I think that always stuck at Johnny a little bit. And then, again, my opinion with Sam was, I think she was expecting something more from us, and the fact that at 54 Bus we've always been open and transparent that we will try other things, we will try to show people, our viewers, other baits, and we did show some that were obviously inspired by A Blade with No Name, and those were some of the issues that really stuck with Sam, and the issue of us not possibly showing her enough respect, as it were. I can look back on it, and maybe I was a little bit too jumpy at times, but that relationship was already starting to break. I was growing weary of the games within the IC. It was time for a change for me and for our brand. So what came first, the chicken or the egg? Sam Dadson, she built the Gronkel. I don't think she was prepared for what it was to become. And 54 Bust, we created A Blade with No Name. And together, it was one of the most infamous bucktails for a 3-year run. And as I go into 2025, I'm still getting the odd message asking about it. But I just tell them I'm not connected with Dadsons anymore. You have to look elsewhere. But it's a piece of our history. It's something that I'll always look back fondly with. For the most part, it's unfortunate how it ended, but that's just the way things go. Check out this video right here, which is the very first trailer that we made for it, and that's where we introduced A Blade with No Name to the public. And check out this video right here if you want to see the very first fish that I ever caught on what I just called a Dadson with a dangle blade.